collaborative with Capistrano Unified School District, the San Clemente Community Education event. We're really excited to keep seeing this kind of crowd come out so we can really work on the issue of the disease of addiction. One of the great groups of students on campus that I think everyone should be aware of is the SOS Club, and they are a group of kids that plan healthy activities for students and support healthy choices on campus and off. They are holding regular monthly activities, and our big drive now is to include 8th graders in all upcoming activities so that they can come into the high school ready to participate in a healthy way. So if you're more interested in that, just tell one of the volunteers and we can get your name on an email list for that. The Wellness and Prevention Center at San Clemente High School provides services to 3,100 high school youth and coordinating it with the teachers, administration, and staff at the high school. The program provides education, interventions, and family support to ensure our youth have the information and access to services that help them make a healthy transition into adulthood. The center is funded through several different grantees, and we do ask for community support to make sure this is a sustainable program. We'd like to increase the hours and the staffing and the community education down to the middle school and elementary school level. So there's donation forms in back and donation jars as well. Your support here is what makes programs like this available, and then programs that are directed right at your children. So just remember that, and there's going to be a lot of community fundraising going on, so you're going to be hearing a lot about the Wellness and Prevention Center. In back is Village Books. They're selling David and Nick Sheff's books at a discount tonight, and after the event tonight, David Sheff will sign your book for you. So I hope you can stay around for that. After David Sheff speaks, we will have a question and answer session. Those little index cards on your seat and that you were handed on the way in, you write your questions on there whenever you have one tonight, and you can pass it down to the end of your row, and our volunteers with the blue buttons will pick the index cards up, and we will get as many questions answered as we can. We have a long list of sponsors, and they're all in the banner in the back. The one sponsor I really want to point out is Dr. Ron Redmond and his family, and we really want to thank them because they made the last big donation that made the program possible tonight. As this is the kickoff event for a series of continuing community education presentations, the goal of these presentations is to provide the public with the most current information about healthy lifestyle choices. The Youth Coalition of the San Clemente Collaborative chose to start this series by addressing addiction. And my hope is tonight that you leave understanding that addiction is a brain disease that should be treated medically with evidence-based treatment. As a nation, we are currently failing in our efforts to effectively treat this public health epidemic. In future months, we will have follow-up programs in order to continue this discussion and to note the progress we are making as a community to help those suffering with the disease of addiction. Pencil Box Designs made these wonderful posters around the room, and I'd really like to just take a moment of silence so we can recognize the memory of all the beautiful children that we've lost in our town. I'd also like us to take a moment to recognize the suffering that a lot of families and individuals are still going through right now. I really encourage everyone to help your neighbor, your friend, or families that you know who may be battling this disease. And just remember, this isn't a moral failing, this is a brain disease, and everyone needs to get treatment for this. I'd like to introduce Dr. Daniel Hedrick, who's going to provide a brief introduction to our speaker tonight. Dr. Hedrick is a board-certified addictionologist and is the director and co-founder of Mission Pacific Coast Recovery. He's a family man who's raised his own children right here in the community, and he has been in addiction medicine for 27 years and treated over 16,000 people. When he's not busy working at his addiction center, he's out here in the community providing more education and trying to educate and help whoever he can. Dr. Hedrick?
Okay. Yeah, usually I'm used to talking to a lot of people, but usually they're a couple days sober. And half there and half not, and I have to get kind of animated and obnoxious sometimes to just get their attention. So it's great to have a sober group here. Taking serious action is the title. And I normally I haven't done introductions before, but I really wanted to for David, because he's really clarified a picture in my mind of our target, where we're trying to go, better than anybody else that's in the field of medicine or addiction medicine. He's talking about prevention, and his book, Clean, is the best one I've read. He's done a lot of homework, a lot of research. He's put a lot of pieces together and shown us what works and what doesn't work. And what I read into that clean is not clean and sober, it's clean like, let's stop people before they ever start using. That's clean. You know, how do we do that? I mean, can you believe that is possible? Can we stop people before they start using? Or at least 99.9% of the kids never use. I mean, can you visualize that? And that's one of the reasons why I'm introducing him, because I want you to try to visualize that when he's talking. Because he can give you more and more pictures about that. And if we can't visualize that, it's never going to happen. Because that's the only way it's going to stop. I detox all those people, and now we're opening an adolescent center, we're going to treat them younger. But it's always going to keep going until we make the stigma of using not cool. Or worse than acne, or something. I mean, we got to come up with some ideas. I don't know what it's going to be, but I know I can picture it, what it's going to look like. If we can't draw a picture of it in your mind and your heart, then it's not going to be possible. We can do that. My picture, 99% of people never start using. What would that look like in all our schools and stuff? I mean, if enough of us can do that, it makes this huge amount of energy that happens. So my picture is like, kids are still getting high, they're just not taking chemicals. They're getting high on writing the book, or surfing, or music, become a lawyer, wild music, weird colored hair, you know, doing crazy stuff. But they're not taking chemicals. And my picture also is that they're so sober, everybody's so clean, that they come home and drug test their parents. You could go wild on this. I mean, all dreams are legitimate. And then I thought, like, wow, what happens if that happens really fast? What happens if this dream really happens? You know, like, well, give yourself 100 years if you want, but, you know, what happens if it actually happens in 2 years? Drugs. David would probably have to have a bodyguard, because the drug cartels would be after him. That's my picture. I mean, it's kind of, you know, but you got to picture this. You know, that would really, you know, how does it feel in your heart if this happens? And it's going to take a long time. But you know what's really interesting about this building is about 7 years ago, there was a group of about 9 St. Clemente residents that found out there's really some mistakes and there's some dangerous, messy things happening at the San Onofre power plant. They had no knowledge of fission or fusion or anything. They just knew there were some facts and there was a whistleblower. And they took off, and over 7 years, they actually convinced Edison that it was a dangerous place. And they shut it down. Yeah. It's right here in this room that they started that. So we can do it, and unfortunately it's probably going to come from outside the field. A lot of doctors are the problems. I mean, there are good doctors, and there's bad doctors too. But there's good doctors that are just ignorant, that don't know what they're doing, and we're trying to stop that too. And here's an article, here's the magazine, here's Pain Magazine. This is like a huge group. They have conferences, international conferences, 7,000 doctors will show up there. There's a new drug There's a new opiate. Did you know that? Zohydro. It's like totally unnecessary. The FDA hired 11 experts to figure out whether they should market it or not. 9 of them said no. And the FDA said, no, we're going to do it anyways. And so the next issue that came out in Pain, the first 5 pages is about Zohydro. It's a new opiate that you can use. It doesn't have all the safety features that OxyContin has in it. You just chew it, you can smoke it, you do anything you want. It's stronger than OxyContin. 5 pages of it. A governor in Massachusetts finally got it, and he declared, he used his emergency powers and declared that Zohydro is illegal. He said it's not going to be sold in Massachusetts. So it's not the FDA that's going to save us, just like the Nuclear Regulatory Commission wasn't going to save us from San Onofre. It was part of the problem. Just like the FDA is part of the problem. It's going to be from people like you, grassroots, that are outside the field and just motivated and have this mission in your picture. So paint that picture, let David paint that picture in your brain and your hearts, and we'll get a start on this tonight, and maybe this will happen sooner, and then I can retire, and my girlfriend would like that. Okay. All right, David, come on up.
Well, it's so great to be here. Dr. Hedrick, thank you. And also, I can picture it. You talk about that. And part of the reason I can picture it, I think, is because I look out here and I see a room full of people who are going to help to make it happen. Your community, I'm not just trying to flatter you, but just by the fact that you're here, by the fact that this was organized in the face of what is a crisis, it's remarkable. Marcy Mendick and Susan Parmalee, and Kathleen Kaiser, thank you, and thank you to the organizations that are here that are sponsoring it. It's remarkable because I have been to cities around the country, and there's not one city anywhere that is not facing this crisis. But most of them, they'll have events and they'll be organized by, unfortunately, guess who? People who know about this problem because they have experienced the worst possible outcome. Mostly it's parents who've lost their kids. They'll bring together people and they'll have a handful of people sitting around in a circle, a dozen people or 2 dozen people. What is it going to take? So basically I'm going to talk about our children tonight, and what got me here, I never planned to be talking about this subject at all. I had no interest in it. My sense of what addiction, my only image of what an addict was, my only thought about what an addict was is when I would walk down the streets in San Francisco where I live. It's in the Tenderloin, and every community has one, and it's sort of the Skid Row, the derelict sitting in the corners, the homeless, there's some cases psychotic, begging, there's people that we sort of, when we walk by them, we avert our eyes and don't want to see and don't want to acknowledge them. I mean, that's what an addict looked like as far as I was concerned. And I learned the hard way that I was wrong. So just as a little background, my book, Beautiful Boy, is about the experience that brought me here, which was when I was, I have a son who's my firstborn son. He was born in Berkeley. I think every parent feels this way about our children. All of you know this very well, but when he was born, it was magic. My life changed. There was this new being in the world that I adored more than anything, more than I knew that I could ever feel about anybody or anything in the world. So being a father was transformative for me, and then watching my son grow up was a joy. In the book, I tell some stories about Nick when he was little, and I'll explain why I tell them in a minute. But it's sort of, I think, when we look back as parents, we look back for clues. We look back for moments when we could have seen, when we could have predicted, and so when we could have made different choices. But when Nick was growing up, and he was just this extraordinary kid, and I just was so proud of him. I watched him. I tell the stories in the book about when he was in kindergarten, and sort of his personality began to emerge when there was a period of time when he would only wear tights to school, and very determined no matter what I said. And the kids would tease him, of course, only girls wear tights, and his response was, Superman wears tights. And the other, another one I remember really well is when the teacher in their class had the kids write about themselves, whether they live in a house or an apartment, and with their mom or their dad or both, or whatever their family was like. And one of the questions that they asked the kids was, the question was, what color are you? And Nick very earnestly answered that he was beige. So the reason for these stories, it seems so, they seem so innocent or something, they seem so disconnected from why we're here now. And the reason is, I think that we have to remember, is that we have, as I said, an image of what addicts look like. And they don't look like our children. They don't look like our kids, and they never, ever, in my wildest imagination, they didn't look like my son. But now we do know that they look like all of our children. And we have to know this, that anyone is susceptible to this disease. We have, some kids are more prone to use. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, because we need to know that if we're going to try to prevent our kids from using drugs in the first place, or if we're going to prevent their drug use from escalating to addiction. But no one is immune, and parents have to know this. Parents don't know it. Again, that's why I guess it's so gratifying to see so many people here. One of the ways, there are ways that we can prevent our kids from using. It's a big, big challenge. It's a big challenge. Our culture we're inundated. Drugs are everywhere. The movies, I'll go to see, one of the Seth Rogen movie with my kids, and they make it look so much fun. I mean, I want to get high. It looks great. And we don't see, on the other hand, I just told someone this story, that when Daisy, my daughter, was starting high school, she was so excited. She was moving on from 8th grade, and she was going to become a high school student. And she was so excited, and she came home after the first day of school, and she was so, so sad. And she said, everyone uses drugs. Everyone gets high. And I said to her, that's not true. Not everyone gets high. And she said, well, everyone cool gets high. And that is the way that kids feel. That is the way that they think. We have to change our culture so that we are not about celebrating getting wasted. And that's what we're doing. And there are things that we can do that we can affect that. But the first thing we can do is much more close to home, things that we can do ourselves. So it's absolutely important that we all know that any child can become addicted. But there are some kids who are more likely to become addicted, and the reason that it's important to know that is because we can look at our kids in a different way if we understand that they're at higher risk, and we can also we can resist doing what we parents want to do when we see that our kids are in trouble, which is we want to write it off and to say it's okay, it's normal, it's about growing up. Of course kids are moody, of course kids are, it's too scary to imagine that our children might be in real trouble. And so what happens is that we do ignore it, and we ignore it, and we ignore it until we can't ignore it anymore. So the first thing that we know is that there is a genetic component to addiction, which means that if there is addiction, alcoholism in a family, kids are more likely. I mean, yeah, kids are at much more, much higher risk. There are other kids that are more likely to use, and it makes sense when you think about it, kids who are struggling as they're growing up with whatever it is. Kids with learning disabilities, kids with attention deficit disorder, kids with depression, some serious psychiatric illnesses like whatever, depression, schizophrenia, I mean things that haven't maybe been diagnosed, eating disorders, stuff that may be a little bit even harder to identify, things like kids who just are isolated or overly aggressive or who have bad self-esteem. We know that trauma is a risk factor, and that can be anything from kids who are in the middle of a battleground when their parents are having a terrible divorce, or even in a family that is, where there's lots of yelling, there's lots of stress, or homes, of course, when there's more obvious trauma, when there's abuse, when there's the loss of someone that's important to a child. So we need to know about these risk factors because we understand then, once we do know, that we don't take them for granted. We don't assume that the kids are going to be okay. A friend of mine runs a school in San Francisco, and she told me that obviously if you run any school, then you're going to be living with families for many years. This was a grade school, so she had these kids from when they're kindergarten to when we're in 8th grade. And she said, so of course, over the course of that time, there are going to be families who split apart, parents who have divorces. And she said that she would run into the parents often during the process of the divorce, over the months or even years that this would be happening. And she would talk to them, and she would say to them, of course, how is everything going? And they would have these very sort of grim faces and say, it's been really, really, really hard. But at least, John or Sarah, whatever, at least my child is doing fine. And what my friend Susan said is they were never doing fine. But we have blinders on. We can help it. There are reasons for it. I think in some ways parents are programmed for denial, and then when we're doing something as stressful as a divorce or something else that's really catastrophic in our lives, it's hard to see. And we don't want to see, because then we have to figure out what to do about it. But we have to see. How do you know? You can't know. One of the problems, one of the fallacies that I think in our culture says that we have to do everything. We're parents, we have to do everything. We have to make every decision about how to raise our kids, and we have to know what's going on in their lives, and we can't. We're not trained. So what we need to do, though, is to pay close attention and to realize, because we aren't trained, we have to find out, and we have to find out from somebody who is trained to do that. So if a child is exhibiting anything that gives you concern, suddenly a child does seem withdrawn, does seem struggling with academics or socially, moody, changing their friends in a really dramatic way, a little bit more secretive, whatever it is. Maybe nothing's wrong. It's always hard again because parents think, that's what kids do. They're teenagers, of course they're moody, or whatever it is. But a pediatrician who works with a lot of kids who end up, who have drug problems in early stages, says, her advice to parents is that if you think there's a problem, there's a problem. You may be wrong. That would be great to find out, but you've got to find out. So that's the time to find someone who can help work with you to figure out what's going on with your child, and that involves having conversations with whomever you can find, whether it's their teachers, counselors, doctors, counselors, psychologists. And to know that there are these risk factors can sometimes feel overwhelming because it's hard. How do you protect our kids? And is there anything we can do? A lot of times we feel that it is beyond us. It is too big of a problem. These forces outside of us are too strong. So we feel like we cannot do anything. But the reality is, and this is demonstrated over and over again, the reality is that we can do something. We can prevent our kids from using. We can protect our kids. All the risk factors that I mentioned, you can't change someone's biology, but you can affect every other part of their lives. And so these risk factors can be mitigated, and I'm going to talk about some of the ways that we can do that soon. So Nick, this lovely being, is growing up, and he is still this great kid, and I did what you're supposed to do. you know, we all know we're supposed to talk to our kids about drugs, so I did. I talked to him, I warned him, I told him what I knew about drugs, which was a lot. I mean, I was not naive about drugs. I understand they're out there, first of all, of course. I know about the ubiquity, and I know about the seduction to use them, and the pressure among children, you know, the peer thing that goes on all the time. So I talked to Nick about drugs. I told him about it. One of my best friends, who was someone I grew up with and was my college roommate for a while, and he overdosed and he died. So we had the conversations, and I thought we had this incredibly close bond and that I would know what was going on with him. And so when I found a bag of pot in his backpack, I was brokenhearted. I was stunned. He was only 12. He seemed so young. And I did what I knew to do, which was I talked to him about it, and he said exactly what I wanted to hear. Oh, some kid gave me this stuff, and I really didn't want to do it, but I tried it, and I hated it, and I'm never going to do it again. And then I went to his teacher. You know, a lot of people, I hear about this, a lot of people are so embarrassed about this, and they don't want to talk about it, and they're so ashamed, and they're afraid that their child is going to be judged, that they would never go to the school to talk about it, because they don't want their kid to be singled out as this problem child who potentially has, you know, is using drugs. But I didn't, because I was worried enough that I wanted to get all the help I could get. So I went and I talked to his teacher, and I sat down. We had a little conference with my wife Karen and I, and the teacher and the school counselor, and we sat in a circle, and they told me, Nick told me what I wanted to hear, they told me what I wanted to hear. They said, listen, drugs are out there, kids are experimenting, you know, it's just happening, it's a rite of passage, it's part of our culture. Nick is a great, great kid, he's got lots of friends, he's a really good student, Nick will be fine. Just what I wanted to hear, but of course, he wasn't fine. His drug use was underground, so I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know what to look for. He hid it well, but it escalated. And on one hand, there were two things going on at the same time. That was, when I look back, when I understood what was going on, it was so confusing to me, because we look at our kids, we have these expectations about what we imagine for our kids, about what we want for our kids, and we judge them by what we're seeing on the outside, often. And according to all of those things I watched as Nick was growing up, he was doing great. You know, he was a perfect student. He was a perfect student. He was a great, you know, he was a sports, he was on the captain of the water polo team, and he was on the swim team, and he was a writer on the school newspaper, and it seemed like he had a lot of friends. It seemed like he was happy a lot of the time. You know, when we had two other kids, our younger children, Daisy and Jasper, Nick he seemed, you know, overjoyed, and he seemed so connected. But what was happening at the same time, which stuns me to think about what I was looking at and what I wasn't seeing at the same time, is that he was using drugs to the point that pretty soon he was smoking pot in the morning, at lunch break at school, in the evening. He was drinking when he could get liquor, and then he started to use pills, and then he used crack, and then he used crystal methamphetamine. He used basically every drug known to man, and every time I thought it couldn't get worse, it did. Finally, I learned that, I only learned because I remained in denial until I could no longer be in denial, because Nick just disappeared one night. You know, if you've been there, you know what it's like. Only parents who've been there can know. You know, it was midnight on a Friday, whatever it was, and Nick was supposed to be home, and he wasn't. And I was really angry. You know, he missed his curfew, he's going to be in trouble, I'm going to ground him. But then it was 12:30, and then it was 1 o'clock, and then it was 2 o'clock, and he was, there was no sign of him. I had no idea where he was, and so I got on the phone and I called his friends' parents. No one had seen him. Then it was 4 o'clock in the morning. My wife and I were sitting in the kitchen. Obviously I was beside myself with worry. My mind's spinning out of control. You know, where is Nick? I got on the phone, and I sort of held my breath, and I called the hospital, the local emergency room, to see if maybe he'd been in an accident. There was no sign of him. I called the police station near us, and they hadn't seen him. In the morning, we spent that night in anguish. In the morning, Daisy and Jasper woke up, ready for school, sort of padding into the kitchen, and they could tell that something was horribly wrong. Their mom and dad were sitting there completely freaked out, and Jasper says, "Where's Nick?" And we didn't know. I finally knew when we first of all endured that same terror, that same unknowing for 24 hours, 48 hours, 3 days, 4 days. And finally Nick did call, and he was a wreck, and of course I was relieved to know that he was alive. I went to get him, and my denial was gone at that point, because I saw him and I saw that he was going to die if something didn't happen, if something didn't change. Here was my son on the street in an alleyway. He was emaciated and bruised, and he looked as close to being dead as a person could be, and I sort of helped him up and got him in the car, and we talked for a while, and that's when I learned for the first time that I learned about the drugs he was using, and I learned that he was mainlining drugs, and as I wrote in Beautiful Boy, it was, as I say, every time I thought things couldn't get worse, they did, and this was one of those moments. He said, "My son was shooting poison into his arms that not that long ago threw baseballs and built Lego castles, arms that wrapped around my neck when I carried his sleepy body in from the car at night." He was passed out. I brought him home. He was passed out in bed. I didn't know what to do. No one had told me. We had no contingency plan. If my son had a disease, any other disease, or at least any signs of a disease, I would know what to do. I would call a doctor. I would bring him in to see what was going on. I would have the doctor would give him a checkup, either tell me, reassure me, he's fine, or maybe take some tests, and depending on what he found out, he would refer me to a specialist. But here I did. I called our pediatrician. The pediatrician said, he basically admitted that he didn't know what to do, and he didn't know who to call, and he gave me the names of a couple therapists. He did say something about, maybe his use got out of control, but drugs are out there, kids use, Nick's a great kid. He said it again. I called other people, and I was told everything from, you have to kick him out of the house. Nothing short of kicking him out is going to get him to want to deal with his drug problem. People told me to send him to a boot camp. That'll straighten him out. Tough love. Somebody told me to send him to a reprogramming camp in Czechoslovakia. All I knew was I had this ticking time bomb in our bedroom, and that he was going to die, and I had to do something. And so I called, and finally I found somebody who said, my friend went through this. Call her. I called her. She told me about a program in San Francisco. I called them up. They had a bed. They took our insurance, and I brought Nick in. It wasn't easy. I woke him up. He didn't want to go. He had a tantrum. It was hell getting him there, but I did get him there. I dropped him off. And it was a 28-day program, and I thought, this has been hell. I sat in the car weeping, but I thought, thank God, this will be over. I'll pick him up in 28 days, and he'll go back. We'll go back to the life we were supposed to have. He'll go on to college, which is what he was planning at the time. That isn't what happened. No. He got out of treatment. He was okay for a little while. He relapsed. It happened over and over and over again. Before it was over, Nick was talked about his sort of lovely spirit. He also was something else that I knew of him, that I knew he was a moral person. And yet, he broke into our home, he broke into our friends' homes, he lied to me repeatedly. One day, this is another story I tell in the book, that one day his little brother who worshiped him came walking into my office with his little box that he kept his, life savings of $7 or whatever it was, and he said, the box had been ripped open, and he said, "I think Nick took my money." This moral child, something had gone terribly wrong. I made those calls repeatedly because he would disappear repeatedly, so I called the hospitals, I called the emergency rooms over and over and over again. One of the times I called our local sheriff and he'd heard my voice, and sort of this trajectory, and he would learn what it was like to be sober. He would relapse, but he would learn more about himself, learn about his triggers, so his relapses, for a while they got worse and worse, and then for a while they got less severe and less severe until he finally stayed sober. But there was another piece of it. What underlies addiction? Well, we also know that a lot of addiction is related to other problems, as I was talking about. And when Nick was 24, I think it was, he'd been already through 8 programs, however many programs, and he'd seen all these doctors. And he had had this crazy relapse. He was in terrible shape. Brought him to see a psychiatrist who'd been recommended to us. He wouldn't go back in treatment, but I convinced him to go see this doctor who was an addiction doctor. And the guy talked to Nick and said, "This kid is going to die." He'd said that to Karen and me. "He's going to die. Could I see his psychological tests?" And I never heard the word. Nick had been in all these. The doctor said, I don't even know what that is. He said, "You mean Nick has been in 8 treatment programs, and he's seen I don't know how many psychiatrists, psychologists, and no one has had him tested." No one had. No one had mentioned it. This guy finally got Nick into some serious testing. It turned out that Nick has bipolar disorder, very severe, type 1, type 2, rapid cycling. I mean, he's got depression. He's got, on my side, a lot of this stuff is inherited, and my side of the family has depression, bipolar disorder. His mom's side of the family has addiction, alcoholism, all over the place, so he's just got it all. So finally, this was diagnosed, and he's now in LA. He works on his addiction, he works on his mental health, he sees a psychiatrist, he's on addiction medication for his bipolar disorder. So as he describes it, he talks about it's a puzzle. And it also is connection to people in treatment, and he learned about how to have relationships. He talks about, he was pretending, he was high when he was like 12 to 25, 4 or something like that. He said, he was still 12 really when he was 24. He didn't know how to have relationships. He didn't know how to break up with somebody. He didn't know he could survive things like that. So all the pieces of the puzzle are hard, but they come together with work, and he's done so much work, which is why I'm so proud of him, and he's just doing great. So, but it's all of those pieces. It's not one. Just drug treatment didn't work for him. Just treatment on his psychological disorders wouldn't have been enough. Just dealing with any one piece. Do you agree with that? So anyway, I guess we'll say thank you so much.
Two announcements before you get up. But go ahead and you can say thank you.
Well, thank you.
To leave you with, how great if every time your kid had a well check, starting from birth, they also had a mental health check. It's not my idea, but I think it's one worth pursuing. So tell people that. When you have a baby, think about finding your pediatrician and your mental health person that they see every year, and your dentist. So one more thing, this is a really cool announcement. There's a rally in Irvine to protest opiates in the marketplace. It's this Thursday. For any of you can make it. It's 11 to 2 p.m. at the FDA offices, 19701 Fairchild, Irvine, California, 92612. I will post this on the Wellness and Prevention Center Facebook page. So just stay around, meet our guests, and they won't kick us out. I can tell you that, okay?
Jeff, have you tried the morgue? I made those calls over and over again, and I also got some of the calls. This is another thing about parents that we share if we've been there. The chilling moment when the phone rings at 3 o'clock in the morning when we don't know where our child is. So the phone rang, and the doctor was calling to tell me that, Mr. Sheff, we have your son here. I think we're going to have to amputate his arm because it had become infected. Another time, a doctor called and said, "You'd better get down here. Your son is overdosed. We don't think he's going to make it for the next 2 hours." Anyone who's been through this knows something else that we experienced in my family. When Nick became addicted and I was able to get him into treatment, many of the programs had family therapy, family lectures, so we started to understand what was going on. Suddenly we have a child who's a drug addict? Impossible. So they brought us in, and one of the things I kept hearing in these lectures and in these groups and in these conversations was that addiction is a family disease. And I didn't understand that. I thought, no, Nick is addicted, he's the one with the problem. But it didn't take long for that to sink in, because I realized that not only was Nick's addiction destroying him, but it was destroying our family. I couldn't work, I couldn't function. Nick would disappear over and over again, and I didn't sleep. Feels like I didn't sleep for years. I did what I could, and Karen and I did what we could to take care of Daisy and Jasper as well as we could, trying to protect them as much as we could. But not only were they intensely confused, and also they were worried about their big brother who they adored. They didn't understand, but also they were traumatized because their parents were. When Jasper was, I can't remember exactly how old he was, but he was really young, and we were in front of our house, and we were actually Nick was home from a treatment center, and we were all so happy, and we were actually going to have a family day at the beach when a sheriff pulled up in front of our house. And the sheriff got out of his car, and he came up, and I thought he was going to ask me for directions or something because it made no sense, but he walked right by me, and he went and he took Nick by the arm, and he put handcuffs on Nick. And what Jasper did, I looked over, and what Jasper did is even that young, he had this instinct to protect his little sister, and he wrapped around Daisy so she wouldn't see her big brother being dragged away by the police. Another time, Daisy was in 8th grade or 7th grade or something like that, and she was asked by her teacher, the kids were, once again, they're writing about themselves, writing about their families, and Daisy wrote in a paper for this teacher, she wrote, "I was born into a lattice work of lovely oceans and hunched, shadowed vampires tangled together in an inseparable knot. Most of what I remember about being little is marvelous, with my 2 wise brothers carrying me upon their shoulders. But then, everything sort of flipped over. Nick was tired and slinking, and then he was gone. My strong pillar parents crumbled." Their pillar parents crumbled. Their world crumbled. The bedrock of their lives, their parents, supposed to be there, supposed to provide them with their sense of home, their sense of security, we had crumbled. And then, even then, Nick's use worsened. There was a cycle. We would be in hell because we didn't know where he was. There would be something would get him home. Either he got in such bad shape that he would call and I could find him. He was arrested. He broke into our home one time and I confronted him. He didn't know I was home. I mean, there were different times that I was able to get him into treatment, and he would do better for a while. He came out of treatment almost every single time, committed, deeply committed to staying sober, trying to understand what had happened to him. Even as I was trying to understand it, he was trying to understand it too. It didn't make sense to him. People talk about this, I'm talk a little bit more later about this idea that this can't be a disease. People choose this. People choose to take drugs. No one forces a person to take drugs. Nick didn't choose to be an addict. No one chooses to be an addict. It's true that people do choose to take that first hit of pot or take that first drink, but no one chooses to become addicted. So he would do better, and then something would happen, and it would mystify him as much as it would mystify me. But he would relapse over and over again. He relapsed, and every time he relapsed, we were in despair. Every time he was doing better, there was hope. Finally, though, after what was probably at that point 7 or 8 treatment programs, he lived in a sober living house. He was in some outpatient programs. Eventually he was sober for a year, which felt like a miracle. And then he was sober for another 6 months, so maybe it was a year and a half. And I'm a journalist. That's what I've done my whole life. And one of the ways I deal with the world, inside my head and outside my head, is I write. And I felt that there was something important to say about what had happened to our family. And basically it's what I've said before, which is, we thought this could not happen to us, and it did. I want you to know that it can happen to you too. So I wrote an article that was in the paper, in the New York Times, and then that led to Beautiful Boy, and that experience is really why I'm here now. When those were published, I knew from our own experience about, and a few other people, families we met in some of these treatment programs, I knew about the hell that goes with this disease. I knew about the suffering, but I did not understand how many people suffer this disease. I did not understand. And when those stories came out, there were phone calls, there were letters, there were emails, more than I could ever count. It started off, 100, hundreds, thousands. I still get them every single day. I go look at my, the direct messages in whatever, Twitter, or the private messages in Facebook or emails. And I heard from not just parents, but I heard from many, many parents, but I heard from husbands and wives and brothers and sisters and children of people who were addicted, and I heard it over and over again, and they all said basically the same thing. They said some version of, how did you get into our home? You told our family story. Your family story is our family story. They said it over and over again, and sometimes the letters would come in and they would be written in pencil and tiny, tiny script, and they would go on for pages and pages and pages. And the thing that struck me, and as I read these over and over again, is that there was a theme. It wasn't only that we had shared this struggle, we were blindsided, but it was also something else. Why were they writing to a stranger? They were writing to a stranger because they were ashamed. They were afraid of being judged. They were afraid of having their loved one, whoever it was, judged. And so they wrote these letters that would go on for pages and pages and pages, and at the end they would say, and no one knows. People who are sitting next to me at work in the next cubicle, they don't know. My neighbors don't know. In some cases, my parents don't know, because I don't want them to know that my child, their grandchild, is a drug addict. Nothing can make living through this easy, ever. But the silence, the hiding, the shame, they make it so much worse. They make it so much worse because we think we're alone. We feel like we're suffering alone in a way that no one else has suffered, and we realize that we are not alone. It's an enormous relief. And it is also a way to, it is the beginning of healing, because then we can get support, we can ask for help. The other thing that I heard from the people who wrote, and these letters came more often than I could digest. They said to me, how did you get into our house? Your story is our story, except ours had a different ending. My beautiful boy died. My lovely daughter didn't make it. As I say that, I'm looking straight back to the back of this room with the photographs of all the beautiful children who didn't make it. I was left then with these questions. I thought, something is going on, and we're not talking about it. What is going on? Why are we losing so many of our children? Why is there so much suffering? And I was ready at that point. Actually, my plan had been to leave this stuff and go back to something I'd been working on before. I was working on a business book about architecture, and I thought, no, because of these people, that I heard from and I met, I couldn't go back. I had to try to understand what had happened to our family and what was happening to so many families out there. And so I decided then to push everything else away and spend whatever it took to try to understand what this thing is. What is addiction that we talk about so often? What is addiction? And why are we so inept at preventing it? And why are we so inept at treating it when it afflicts someone that we love or afflicts when we are afflicted? And what I found very quickly was something that I wasn't expecting. I didn't know what I would find, and this is what I found. I found that, I guess, if I had been left with that information, that just the fact that this is this plague that is hitting every community around the country, that is hitting, we know that 1 out of every 10 people, 1 out of every 10 of our children suffer this disease. We know now that 350 people are dying every single day of this disease. Because of the current epidemic of prescription drug misuse, we're losing 1 person every 19 minutes. 1 person every 19 minutes. I just was told here that in Orange County, 1 child is dying every other day because of an addiction overdose, an overdose mostly on prescription pills. So I would have taken this information in and been heartbroken and resigned, if that's all I found. But that's not what I found. I found out that this is a problem that can be prevented, and yet we're not preventing it. This is a disease that can be treated, and we're not treating it. And so that sadness and resignation changed for me. And instead of feeling hopeless and feeling this just bleak acceptance that this was happening out there, instead I felt rage. I felt rage. I felt we can prevent this, we can treat this, why are we failing? Why are we failing our children? And I thought we have to do better. So that's what my work turned into, to try to figure out why we were failing, what we could do better. And it was a sort of a recognition that it was not only about, it wasn't just, I mean, the suffering in families is undescribable, it's unmeasurable. And so we can understand why people who are afflicted or themselves or who have family members who are affected by this disease, you can understand why we care, why we pay attention. But this is a cultural problem. It is devastating our culture. Our society is spending, Columbia University did a study and they said that we are wasting, addiction in America costs us $425 billion every year because of addiction doesn't only cause the people who are addicted to become ill, but it also leads to crime. It causes, we have in America more people in our criminal justice system than anywhere else in the world. And we often think that we are the civilized ones. We are so much farther advanced than all the other countries in the world, but we have more people in our prisons than China, than Russia. And most of them are there, about 80% of them are there because of drugs. Those billions of dollars are spent on, we have a healthcare crisis. And yet, more emergency rooms, in some inner city emergency rooms, 85 to 90% of the people who come into an emergency room are there because of drugs, alcohol. About $200 billion a year in lost productivity costs. And we're talking about competitiveness. And these are issues. These are issues that you don't have to even be sympathetic to people who are interested in addiction because we care about it so deeply because of our personal experience. You can be all you could care about is the bottom line, and yet, people aren't talking about this disease. And so, the rage, it's spreading. It's happening more and more, and it's happening because of this new crisis. It's not that we haven't always been losing people to drug addiction, but the numbers are so extraordinary because of the prescription pill problem that there are people who, even in spite of the shame, are saying enough. They are saying, I will no longer sit back and allow this to happen in my neighborhood, in my community, in my school. And they are coming together, and they are in rooms just like this today. And that is why, in spite of the catastrophe, in spite of these numbers, in spite of the horror, that I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because of meetings like we're having tonight here. So I learned that this is a disease that can be prevented. So how can we prevent it? There's a whole list of ways that we can prevent it that people don't know, and a lot of it falls on the shoulders of parents, a lot of it falls on the shoulders of teachers in schools, and a lot of it falls on the shoulders of larger communities. The biggest protective factor that counters all of the risk factors that I talked about, the biggest protective factor is you. It's me, it's us, it's parents. We or our other children's, whoever our kids' caregivers are, have more of an influence on what happens to them than anyone. It may seem obvious, but it's important to say that because sometimes I think that we forget, or it's not even that we forget, it's that we think that we don't think we can make a difference, especially when our kids get older and communicate with their parents. They are less likely to use. There are measures that they've done to show that there are certain things that measure that the kids who are less likely to use are ones who, for example, have dinner with their families. Why? I don't think there's anything magic about dinner. I think it's just about a time, a structure. People are together, there's community, there's bonding, there's family, there's hopefully a time for conversation, for parents to check in with how their kids are doing. Another time that does the same thing is doing homework with your kids. Again, a time to be with them, to show that you care about them. Sometimes it's not practical to do homework, sometimes for families are working, whatever it is, you can't have dinner. But the point here is that it is important for us to spend time, and a lot of times we say, well, quality time is what's important. Quality time is important, but quantity time is important. Talking to our kids, we talk about that. I said that I told Nick all this stuff about drugs, and I felt we had a really close relationship. When I look back and when I talk to him now, I realize that there was a conversation going on, but it wasn't the conversation that needed to be going on. As I said, we pay attention to if our child is doing badly in school, we want to know what's wrong with them, how we can help them get better grades. We are able to, but we are not trained or informed that we need to look closer. And so the kinds of conversations that we have with our kids, they have to be, oftentimes we talk to our kids, and we don't listen. We have to learn how to listen, and we have to learn to kind of find out where they are and to go to where they are and to move forward with them. And the way that, again, we're parents, nobody gives us a manual to be parents. Does talking to our children in a really helpful way come naturally? Well, maybe a little bit, but no, I think that we need help, and sometimes it involves, if there are problems going on in the family, not to wait until they get worse and worse and worse until there's a crisis. That's the time that we maybe as a family need to go talk to a counselor. Short of that, parent effectiveness training. I mean, there are ways that we can learn to be more effective when we communicate with our kids, and when we are, everything changes. It does protect them from drug use. It protects them from other problems, from problems that they would have in school. It protects them from a whole host of things. They do better in school. I mean, there's all this stuff that tells us that that this thing that is logical, that this relationship with their parents is the most important thing, and so we have to do everything we can to bolster it continually, even as things change, even as they grow up. yes, there is something about children, especially when they become adolescents, that is part of who they are, that makes them reckless sometimes, it makes them want to experiment, it makes them impulsive, curious, sometimes, it's what it means to be a teenager. Which is why sometimes it's so hard when we see our kids being a little crazy when they're teenagers, we think, well, it's what it is to be a teenager. So we have to recognize we can't fight that, and we shouldn't try to fight that, because that is developmentally appropriate. It's going to happen as teenagers are growing up. So the question then is, are there ways that we can find to help them experience that impulsivity, to experience that adrenaline rush that is what kids crave, help them satisfy their curiosity, do things in ways that are healthy, help them find ways to get high that are healthy for them. Like you said, surfing, sports, adventure things, things that challenge them, getting them engaged in whatever it is for them. We also know that just as some of these protective factors lower drug use, the more kids play video games and the more kids are on computers, the more likely they are to use. Does that mean we should throw our kids' computers out and phones so they can't be on Facebook? I mean, we know that's not going to happen. But maybe it is realistic to realize that this is stuff that has been shown to be true. So maybe it's realistic to set time limits and not to allow a kid to have their phone or their computer in their room after bedtime or 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock, because a lot of times they'll stay up all night doing social media on Facebook and stuff. And the other thing that they'll do is they won't sleep, and sleep is another protective factor. So, and how many teenagers do you know that get enough sleep? The other thing that I think is, I hear this all the time, and it's because we're so confused. Parents are so confused. I hear all the time confusion that is expressed because I think it maybe has to do with my generation. We grew up with drugs. My parents didn't use drugs. When they told me, when they would try to talk to me about drugs, they had no credibility whatsoever because they had no idea. But I grew up in a community, a time that, our generation, we knew. And so it really is problematic because a lot of parents I hear from will say to me, it's okay. I feel, this is of course with high school kids mostly, but sometimes even younger in middle school, as long as they use in moderation, it's okay. I smoked when I was a kid, and look at me, I'm fine. It's okay. It's okay, they tell their kids who are going to a party, they have this, what they consider to be another one of these really wonderful parent-child bonding moments, and they say, I know you're going to a party, I know there's going to be liquor, but just whatever you do, don't get in the car with anyone who's high. There's a whole list of the kinds of excuses that we make, but any excuse that we make, any message we communicate like that is sanctioning drug use. And we know that I talked about the other risk factors. Another risk factor is that the earlier someone uses drugs, the more likely they will become addicted. I said that Nick started when he was 12. Another piece of it, this I hear from a lot, especially as in older high school kids. I will allow my kids to have wine with us at dinner, or I allow them even to smoke at home because I don't want them out, getting in trouble. And I want them to learn moderation and to use responsibly while they're home in my care, because then they're going to go off into the world, they're going to go off to college or whatever, and then they're going to go wild. We hear about binge drinking, we hear about all the partying that goes on at school. So I want to teach them to use drugs and alcohol responsibly. The earlier they use, the more likely they're to become addicted, the more likely they're going to have drug problems. The more we allow it, the more we sanction it. We are giving them a message, whether we intend it or not. We think we're trying to protect them, but we're not. And the other thing that happens if we allow drug use of any sort when our kids are teenagers is that they are fragile. Their brains are fragile. Their brains are changing then more than at any other time they'll change in their lives. They're developing their neurological systems, and they're also developing socially and emotionally. And kids who use that growth, it's stunted, and sometimes it doesn't happen. So kids who haven't used by the time they get to college have more likely learned how to handle stress, how to modulate their behavior, and how to sustain relationships. And of course, they're also less likely to become addicted. So there is a lot that parents can do. There's a lot we can do. We feel like we can't have an impact, but we can. We also, though, we are, we're not in this by ourselves. Our children are growing up, not just in our homes, but in our communities, in this whole system that shapes who they are. So we know about addiction is this really complicated disease that has to do with biology and psychology and environment. And one of the things that we can do is we can, as communities, we can create safe environments for them. We can learn how to bolster, how to support families, how to create nourishing and stable alternatives for those kids who lack families, how to create community programs that will engage kids, that will do it in a way that helps parents so they don't have to be the only ones who are trying to help their kids find things that will stimulate them, that will engage them, that will connect them with other kids. We have to have social programs. All of our children need health care. And when we hear these things, the community will say, a lot of people in the community say that these things are too big, what can we do? Well, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are programs out there that have been shown to work. I read a lot of them. I read a lot about them in my book. Schools are using them, communities are using them. There's things, life skills training, parent effectiveness training, a program for teenage mothers called Nurse Family Partnership. Wellness centers, I know you know about that here. It's brilliant that you have a wellness center. There is a program in San Francisco School District, and San Francisco schools have had, probably similar to here, outrageous high numbers of kids who were overdosing and dying. The schools got together with the city's health departments and some of the other health organizations, and they created wellness centers, and they have them right now in about 8 of the schools, and they are, I imagine, similar to the wellness center that you have here. It's a place for kids to go that really is talking about the fact that we care about your mental health, we care about your emotional health, we care about you in the very deepest way, and we are here for you. And it has had an amazing effect. There are counselors on site all the time. They have a program set up so that the kids are sort of ambassadors, and they're teaching other kids and they're training other kids. Not only they're educating them about drugs and alcohol and suicide and other issues that come up, but they're also creating an environment that is, to me, it's extraordinary. They're creating an environment a culture so that kids now will come in, if they go to a party on the weekend and they see a friend of theirs pass out because they're drinking so much, they will come to a counselor on a Monday and say, become in confidence, they'll say, I was at a party and so-and-so, was wasted and I'm really worried. And then the counselor will go to that student and say, one of your friends is just really worried about you. You're not in trouble. Don't worry, you're not in trouble. I just want to tell you I'm here. Let's talk. And they've gotten kids in therapy in the school itself, and sometimes kids need more therapy, more extensive therapy. And they've gotten them into drug treatment programs because kids have had drug problems that have been identified because of that. So the overall numbers are dropping. They have a long way to go, but they're dropping in a way that was unthinkable, it was unimaginable that they could pull that off. Anyway, there's a lot that we could do, There's another program for big communities, for whole communities that don't just focus on schools, something called Communities That Care. And it brings people together like this in a city that is dealing with a specific problem and helps organize, it helps make a plan. And so if things get to the point in any community where the rage is big enough to figure out what to do, there are things to do. The other thing that happens is, I think this is really important, because I think that we also have to recognize the fact that talking to our kids, my son was a big athlete. He was a really amazing athlete. We would watch him and we would be stunned. And still he became addicted. So that list of things, it all helps and it all can help, but there are no guarantees. This is really important, I feel, for all of us to understand. And this has to do, I think it has to do with all levels of drug use. It has to do with kids starting to use at the beginning. It has to do with kids whose use escalates, and then it has to do with kids who become addicted. There was a survey done of thousands of kids around the country, all teenagers, high school kids, and their parents. And they asked their parents why they think kids use drugs. And they answered the way that I would have answered a while back, and probably the way many of us would answer. And they said, well, our kids use drugs because they're kids, because peer pressure, their friends are using, and because it feels good to get high. And they asked the kids the same question, and they basically expected to hear the same thing. And they were surprised, and they were stunned actually by what the kids said. And the teenagers said the main reason, the number one reason that they use is because of stress. So we spend so much time talking about drugs that we aren't talking about what is probably the most important part, or most important piece of it, and that's why kids use. Stress. So what do our kids have to be stressed about? You know, we are, up where I am in Northern California, our school district a few years ago had to cut a ton from their budget. They didn't cut AP classes. They cut sports, art, and counselors. I mean, the three pieces of the puzzle in a school that are there to help our kids' well-being are their physical and emotional health. You know, there's a sense that our kids are, the stress that our kids are under, some of it is peer-to-peer, but a lot of it comes from, a lot of it just comes from the culture, and a lot of it comes from parents, is enormous. And then there are kids who have a different kind of stress, and those are kids who are not, you know, they're in neighborhoods where it's dangerous to walk down the street, or they're in poverty. There are stresses that are very subtle, and I sort of alluded to it a little bit before, but you know, there's stuff going on in the family. There's a death of a grandparent. There's, you know, just stuff that comes up every single day that we don't deal with because we don't know how to deal with it, that contributes to the stress. And then, you know, earlier I talked about risk factors that include things like psychological disorders, like a child with depression is more likely to use, a child with attention problems, a child with learning disabilities. Well, it makes sense. Those kids are under even more stress because they're trying to deal in a world where it seems to them, I mean, Nick used to talk about being in high school, and he said that it felt like everyone else had been given a manual about how to deal with each other. And in the meantime, he said that he was going through every single day feeling, even as he was showing the world, showing me, showing his teachers that he was doing fine, he was in a certain kind of hell. He said that he always felt separate from everyone else. He said that he had this, he didn't know what it was called then, but he had this anxiety inside him that was with him all the time, and only when he got high did he have some relief. So of course he went back and got more. So whatever is stressing out our kids, and it's a whole range of things, if we recognize that all the different reasons that what we want to do is we want to help our children grow up as healthily as we can. And there are things that we can do sort of on the outside, practical things, help them, you know, engage in sports, help them with their homework, spend quality time with them, but also to do what we can to find out what, you know, every child is different, and every child reacts to the same experiences differently. So we want to learn how to pay attention, and if we're unsure, if our child has a problem, we want to go find out and get help right away. We have this idea in our culture that is really dangerous, I think, and it is harming our children. We have this idea when we talk about drugs, we don't talk about we aren't talking about why kids are using. We aren't talking about what you as our children are feeling inside yourselves. That are the kinds of things that might lead you to use. We are talking about, we have this paradigm set up that we have this idea that it's good kids who don't use drugs and bad kids do. But, you know, as this pediatrician says, you know, these aren't bad kids, these are our kids, and we have to help them grow up healthily, safely. I was going to spend time talking now about what happens when our best efforts fail, and we society. Addiction is the #3 killer in America after heart disease and cancer. There is an American Cancer Society, there's an American Heart Association, there is, what's it called, Autism Speaks, there are organizations, and yet there is none for this plague, this devastation, this disease that is both costing our families and costing our children so much money. I have been calling for someone to start this organization, and I met with the head of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and I told her this whole thing, and she said, "You're absolutely right, go start it." And I said, "I wish I could." I'm a journalist. I've been in a lot of meetings recently trying to talk to people about this very thing, and they start showing PowerPoints, and I just basically, my eyes glaze over and I can't pay attention. There are people that are working on this. It has not happened. There is somebody in New York, a group of people who are trying to bring a lot of organizations together. I'm hopeful that it will happen. Someone needs to do this, someone who is able to build an organization. I'm having conversations with people all the time. There's a lot of conversations about it. When something happens, I will do everything I can to make sure everyone knows about it.
All right, this next question I'll let both of you answer, and this is from Save San Clemente. Save San Clemente is a grassroots organization here in town of young adults, kind of the 15 to 30-year-olds, I'd say. I don't want to characterize it wrong. But they're the ones that have really been affected in losing friends right now. And I love this question because I encounter it too. How can we help encourage someone over 18 to get help?
How to get somebody help over 18? That's a lot better, a lot easier than under 18. There's a lot more treatment centers. And how do you get anybody to get help? Because somehow they have to be convinced that they have a problem. And I think being able to talk from your heart and talk to them about early on when they're first starting to use that, even when they're having a beer or two, and if they're a close friend of yours, how that affects you, how that feels like you're losing contact and that the person's abandoning you, and catching it early among your friends, showing the most important thing in any of my relationships, especially with my family and people, my friends, is that I'm present, I'm here, I'm 100% me. I'm not the marijuana me or the alcohol me. And that's what I want from my kids, and that's what I want from my friends. And a lot of my friends aren't alcoholics, but I don't like to hang around with them that much, even if they have a beer or two. It's like, I just value that, and I tell them, if you're visiting me, I don't like you to be drinking, because I really want to be with you. So that's what I think.
I'll only add one piece of, I guess I'll say one thing. If anybody out there, there's this thing that people say that you have to want treatment, you have to be ready for treatment. And the truth is, I'm sure in a program, anybody who works in a program and runs a program knows that most addicts who come in don't want to be there. They don't want to be treated. So it's a myth that somebody wants to be treated. I think that we have to do everything we can to get someone, whether they're over 18 or under 18, treated. Whether it means, one of the things is that there's something that's said over and over again that people, it's something what people said to me about Nick. You have to let them hit bottom, and only then will they be able to be treated. A doctor said to me that we know this is the disease. If someone has diabetes, you wait until you have to take their leg off before you get them treated. You don't want to let people hit bottom. You want to do everything you can to get them into treatment. It's not easy. If love, the ways that we have to persuade someone we care about, it often works if we're persistent. But sometimes we need to work with a professional interventionist, a positive one, not this sort of tough, aggressive kind of tactics. Those apparently don't work and actually can make problems worse. But interventions work. Whatever you can do to get someone to treatment, that's where we want them.
Okay, and I just want to kind of add that insurance shouldn't be an issue. I mean, it is an issue, I'm gonna say that flat out, but as a social worker, there are ways to get people connected no matter what kind of health care you have right now. So, find, look at the resources back here, call people. There are people that can connect you to the services that you can afford to be with.
No, it's not helping you, it's the opposite. I just can't resist this. The first time I've ever told a joke in my life was yesterday. I've only heard this the day before, but because it's related to what you just said, I can't resist. I'll tell it really quickly. This guy, okay, I want to make sure I get it right. It's always three guys, right? So three people were going up to, they were at the pearly gates and St. Peter was there. And so his question to each of them is, why should I let you into heaven? And the first one was a cardiologist, and he said, why should I let you into heaven? And the cardiologist said, he listed all that, I've saved so many people's lives. And St. Peter said, welcome. And the next one was a social worker, why should I let you into heaven? And he said, I've saved families, I've worked with families, I've helped children, whatever. He said, he opened the gates. And the third guy was the head of an HMO. And St. Peter said, why should I let you into heaven? And he said, we give health care to so many people. And St. Peter said, well, I've got some good news and some bad news for you. He said, the good news is that you can come into heaven. The bad news is that you're out in 24 hours.
It's definitely a challenge, but there are a lot of people out there that are going to fight for you. This one I really like because I present to 9th grade health classes, and I just started doing that starting this year. So. And this is one of my biggest fears. My son admits that he listened to the info in health classes in elementary and middle schools. He couldn't wait to try that stuff and see what that would feel like. What do we tell the teachers and textbook people?
I think David has done a lot more research, but my experience in reading is like the Red Ribbon Weeks didn't really work. Every community that they were in didn't really show any improvement. I know from when I was when I was in school too, that there was stuff like that. It kind of attracted me. I mean, genetically, I'm into, my family's all alcoholic, and it was really weird. I remember looking at somebody putting a needle in their arm, and I was like attracted to that. I don't know why. It was the way they brought it up. And you rob banks, and you do all this crazy stuff, and you drive crazy cars. And I went, I kind of want to do that, It really backfired. I think teaching people how to get high in other ways, like in my imaginary dream picture is like there's a required class in high school that you have to graduate from, and it's called How to Get High Without a Chemical. And you have to pass this test and present a paper. How are you going to get high in your life without a chemical?
I'm going to add that to my classroom presentation. I like that. Okay, next one is, how is Nick doing?
Oh, thank you for asking, and that's an easy one to answer because, as I said, we're one of the lucky ones. Our family is so lucky because there were so many times when he almost didn't make it, but he's 5 years clean, which of course is there's a lot of people who are in the throes of this ask this and they talk about this. They say they cannot ever imagine, they can't imagine healing and they can't imagine forgiveness. They think it's impossible. And I can tell you that it is. It's, our family is just closer than ever. I was with Nick a couple weeks ago. Daisy flew down and spent the weekend with him. And, it shows that healing is possible, forgiveness is possible. So never, ever, ever give up.
I also can't resist this one. And please, all you people who allowed me into the school, don't kick me out after this. My daughter is very overwhelmed and stressed with the amount of homework in high school. There's little time to decompress. Any suggestion on how to help her and to get our school to help us?
Well, I guess I'll say right away that, all of you in this room, go, I imagine a lot of you your kids go to the same school, and maybe by virtue of the fact that you've been so organized that maybe your school is not the one that is being described here, but go talk to your school. I mean, what is more important? We have to make sure that our schools remember what their job is. Their job is not to get kids into Harvard. Their job is to get our kids as emotionally healthy as they can That's what we want. We want our kids to be okay. We want them to be healthy. That's their job. And so we have, we're the consumers of their services, and they do respond, but it doesn't take one person. It doesn't help with two people. It takes a movement. It works, and there are schools that have shifted. The only reason those wellness centers are in San Francisco, by the way, it's not because some superintendent decided we're going to start wellness centers. It was because a group of parents said, we have to do something. The suicide, we talk a lot about drugs. The suicide rate among adolescents has doubled in 10 years. What is going on? The stress is enormous. If we understand that stress leads to drug use and other problems, addiction, as well as and suicide and other problems, then why are we worrying about, that's what we need to be worrying about. How can we help alleviate the stress? And some of it, again, as parents, we put stress on our kids. A lot of it is cultural. Another thing, I can quote all these pediatricians because a lot of them are really wise. This one doctor said that I forgot. It was really brilliant, so sorry. I'll think of it.
Okay, just another topic altogether. What is your opinion on the use of cannabis or specific selected cannabinoids for medicinal purposes as opposed to opiate-based prescription pills?
The medical benefits of marijuana have been exaggerated, manipulated, especially when you start talking about exposing it to an adolescent brain. It's a completely different situation. I mean, it takes about 20 years for your brain to fully hook up. And if you start messing with it with marijuana, it's hard to unwind that. There's a lot of research being done now on drug addicts, and some of the studies will find out whether you started using drugs before. They separate you into two different groups, whether you started before 17 or after 17, because it's a whole different situation. Your brain, it's harder to unwind that and repair that if you started before 17. So what I'm seeing people who have marijuana cards and they're teenagers, that's outrageous. But the thing about making it illegal is crazy too. I don't know, there's a real dilemma there too, because there's a lot of damage by putting people into jail for marijuana too. That damages people too. It doesn't help their addiction at all. And sometimes people try to get me to say, well, should we legalize drugs? My answer always is, hey, it's the legal ones that are killing everybody. Cigarettes and alcohol. If we can figure out how to stop killing people from those, maybe we can legalize some of the other ones.
The only thing I'll add to that is goes back to the question about how we can educate our kids and actually how we can have effective education. And some of it is a lot of the social stuff I was talking about in skills, life skills, those kinds of things. But also the scare tactics don't work. You're right. Nick talks about, there was a cop up there who talked about what happens when you use, when he was a kid, it was a teenager, it was about PCP. And it was like, Nick heard that stuff about this, craziness that happens and this energy and all this stuff, and he was just saying, where did I get some? But what actually has worked, and it's specific about marijuana, because marijuana obviously is the drug that most kids, marijuana and alcohol are the drug that most kids would use and start using at the beginning. And what they've done is there's a lot of research that that shows the different ways the brain develops and compares them between kids who use and kids who don't use, and you can see the pictures. The scientists actually, San Diego is where they've done most of the work on this, and they have, in schools, it's this facts. Give them facts, don't try to scare them, give them stuff that they can see. This is the brain of a kid who's been smoking pot, since he was 12, 14, whatever they do, and this is one who hasn't. They're totally different. And look at this part of the brain that is different, that has been affected, that is actually malfunctioning, is the part of the brain that allows us to think well, the cognitive piece, the memory, things like that. And they're related to life stuff. I mean, people who've been, if you smoke a lot, if you use, it has an impact on the developing brain, and it also has an impact on your relationships, on your work possibilities. This one was very powerful for kids. They didn't want to hear about a lot of stuff. It's like, I don't care about my memory and stuff like that. But when they heard that kids who are smoking pot, there's research that shows that kids who start smoking pot and they smoke pot through their adolescence are going to learn, are over on average earning a lot less money as adults. That one kind of sunk into these kids.
Okay, we're gonna do about 2 more and then we're gonna kind of break up, all right? And if I didn't get to your question, I really apologize. They're all really quite excellent, and maybe I'll just leave them with David and ask him to email me. Because he's got to work a little more for us. All right, this one says, thank you. People are working on a sober high school in Orange County. Can you speak to sober high schools across the U.S.?
I'll just say really quickly that they are awesome. There's one, we know, I've got a friend who's starting one in New York. It's going to be the first one there. Next week, Nick and I are actually both going to Austin, Texas, where they're opening their first sober high school. I mean, can you imagine what it would be like? I mean, the stress of being in a place where everybody's using and where you are having, if you have a drug problem, it's really, really hard. And so to be in a community where you're learning that you can actually have fun and be sober, I mean, what a great experience that is. And when with your kids who, you're with the whole community, and I mean, they're brilliant, and it's wonderful that it's happening here. It's huge.
Good, so that means we need to support this. Does everyone hear that? Okay. All right, so I think we'll end on this because this hopefully kind of will wrap up, tie everything together. What was the final cure for Nick after 7 or 8 centers?
Well, first of all, people said, I thought the first time Nick went into treatment for 28 days, he was out. He relapsed, therefore the first treatment didn't work. Well, I talked about this being a progressive disease. We also know it's a chronic disease, which means if it's not being treated over time, there was a lot of conversation around addiction, which it's rarely talked about. But when somebody prominent dies, when Philip Seymour Hoffman died, the great actor, there was a lot of talk about the fact that he'd been sober for 20 years and he relapsed. So one of the symptoms of this disease is the potential to relapse. Obviously, it doesn't always happen, and we want to do everything we can to prevent it from happening. So Nick would relapse over and over and over again. And every one of those treatment programs, almost, there were actually a couple that I would describe that maybe harmed him and maybe set him back. But mostly he got time for questions and for conversations. So I think I won't talk about that. All I will say, the very short version of what I'll say about that is, I have pages to say about that, about the ways that we can recognize drug problems and what we do when we find them. And then if we need to find treatment, how to find it, what to look for, what to avoid. But the main thing I'll say about that now is that this is a progressive disease, which means that if it's not being treated, it gets worse. So at the first signs of problems, get help. So I guess the only thing I'll just close by saying that when I learned this the hard way, and it's the same lesson that was communicated in all those letters that I talked about. When this happened to us, I tried to keep it a secret because I was so shamed and so scared. I thought I would be judged. I must be a terrible father if my child was a drug addict. We are very open. We readily, enthusiastically share our children's accomplishments when they excel in sports, or the honor roll, or the school play, or the funny thing they said in the car, the awards they get, whatever. But we hide when they're suffering, and we hide when we are. So when I wrote that first story for the New York Times about our family, I showed it to a friend of mine, and she read it, and she panicked. She freaked out, and she said, "You cannot publish this." She said, "You are going to, your children, your family is going to be looked at differently in school, in our community, and you're going to be treated differently." And so when I published the article, I was nervous. I braced myself. I didn't know what was going to happen, but what happened was, guess what? There was not any negative judgment. At least if there was, I never heard about it. Instead, there was an outpouring of concern, offers of help, commiseration, and kindness. And I connected with people that I never knew. I would walk through the school, the campus where our kids were going, where Daisy and Jasper were going to school, and a mom that I didn't know came up to me and she grabbed my arm, she dug her fingernails in, and she sort of pulled me aside. And before she could say a word, she was crying. She told me that she had grown up with an alcoholic father, and she was worried because her child, who was an 8th grader, she caught him smoking pot. She hadn't told anyone. Dad told me about his daughter who was actually right at that time in treatment, in dual diagnosis treatment for an eating disorder and addiction. And his voice cracked and his hands shook. He whispered it as if there was just this great shame in telling me about a child who was suffering a serious illness. People told me about their difficult divorces and the losses they'd endured and the trauma they'd experienced. It was like I did for all those years when I was keeping this a secret, the anguish that I was experiencing. I was dying inside. The writer Annie Lamott, she says that we increase our pain because we compare our insides with other people's outsides. It looks as if everyone else is doing great, that their kids are sailing through, but the truth is no one sails through. But when we no longer hide whatever it is we're struggling with, there's, as I said, there's tremendous relief. We can then be supported, we can get help, we can learn that we aren't alone, because we aren't. We're in this together. Life is hard, sometimes it is unbearable, but together, with our openness and with our love and with communication, we can move from this darkness and this suffering, and then there is light and there is healing. So thank you for inviting me here, and thank you most of all for being here, being together as a community to take this on.